Alright, so let's talk about solids. Solids are a form of CSG, which is also known as BSP, and that is a way for the 3D engine, the 3D renderer, to use simple shapes in the 3D environment. You can make them pretty complex, but it's really meant for very simple shapes and outlining stuff. The way CryEngine 3 integrates CSG is slightly different than if you've used other editors in id Tech or Unreal Tech. Those engines, every time you build CSG or BSP, it'll remove any faces that are unseen and compile it into usually as much of like a solid object and delete any unnecessary polygons. And that was really good for saving on poly performance and stuff like that. CryEngine 3's integration of it doesn't do anything like that unless you're using like the union tool, which we'll cover over here in a bit. Just keep in mind that what the CryEngine 3, whenever using solids, it's really meant for just purely outlining gameplay before you commit to making it artistically appealing. So generally, whenever you, for example, this is the blue room of Siege, and the blue room means I use nothing but solids, and I created this very simple outline of the map, and then I brought it into a more advanced tool set like 3D Studio Max and fleshed out all the details. So always keep that in mind, that that's what CSG is for, but we understand that most of you might not have the knowledge or access to 3D tools like 3D Studio Max or Maya and things like that. So one thing to always remember is it's perfectly fine for you to make these maps with these simple shapes, and don't beat yourself up over it. Spend some time with this, get familiar with this, and once you're really comfortable with working in 3D space in these simple shapes, then you might be able to kind of venture into using a more complex package like 3D Studio Max or Maya. As always with CSG, something to think about is you're working with simple shapes, so don't try to sit here and cut into the very little tiny details with solids in CryEngine 3. If you're a level designer that's coming from like Source Engine or UDK and stuff like that, and you've fleshed out maps with BSP and you've gone really far into detail, just remember that that's not really CryEngine 3's thing. They keep it where CSG is kind of in the grand scheme of things in today's modern day industry. Working with CSG is going out. It's a kind of a dying art in a way, because you're just not going to be able to get the fidelity visuals that you're able to get whenever you make a level on something like 3D Studio Max. So keep that in mind. Okay, back to your map. Let's get started. First things first, you want to make sure you have grid snap turned on, so make sure this button up here, the grid snap to grid, make sure that's clicked in, and then you want to make sure you're on a high subdivision. So basically one way to think about this is one grid. This means it's going to snap every 1 meter. So that's 1 meter grid snap, that's 2 meter, 4 meter, and that's 0.5 of 1, 0.25 of 1. 0.125 of 1. You want to stay away from these small numbers as much as possible, and the reason why is once you start building in that small of a subdivision, it's very likely for you to create a lot of errors, a lot of floating objects, walls not connecting, things like that. So go ahead and set the grid snap to 8. Now that you have a grid snap size of 8, make sure you have the XY axis constraints turned on. Okay, now you want to click the solid button in the roll-up bar on the objects tab. Once you do that, you'll see this grid popping around, this little axis like just moving around in the scene. You can see it snapped to the grid because it's very jerky. To make a solid, simply left click, hold, drag, and you'll start to see it fill in. Keep holding the mouse button down, and when you let go, it'll start building up the Z-axis. So go ahead and make an object, just any box, any size. Make sure you note the numbers that are appearing on the object. Right now you can see the 72, 16, and 56. What that's showing you is the dimensions of the box you're creating. Whenever you're done creating your solid, make sure you hit escape. If you don't, and you try to left click or anything, you'll immediately start creating another solid. Now you could do this if you want, and if you're trying to do something very special like build out a floor or something like that. But it's best to press escape after each solid so you don't accidentally create some solids you're not aware of and they're secretly hiding in other objects. Okay, so whenever you have an object created, it's really important to note this. You see the numbers, you see whenever I hover over a solid, the outline of the mesh is turning bright orange. Go ahead and hold shift and press space. Once you do that, you're basically in a mode of inside the editor that shows what the game will look like. It's hiding icons, it's hiding debug text and things like that in the renderer. Just press shift space again and it'll come back. You're going to be using that a lot, so remember that. Shift space will hide all like entity icons, AI path points, all that stuff. And then press shift space again and it'll come back. Okay, let's go over the move tool. The move tool will let you move an object around the 3D space. Whenever you're moving an object around 3D space, you're confined to use three separate axes. You have the y-axis and the x-axis, which will let you go, if you're looking at it from top-down view, it'll let you go left and right and up and down. You also have the z-axis. What the z-axis is depth. So in this case, I'm moving it up and down the z-axis, which is raising and lowering the object based on the world's axis space. Now, speaking of global space, which is the world space, and local space, they're two very different things you need to keep in mind whenever you're making objects and placing them in the game world. What these are is literally when every single object in this world has this axis, it's based on what's called the object's pivot. And the object's pivot, you can almost consider, in most cases, it's usually at some sort of center point, or as defined by the user and artist. Whenever you manipulate an object, either through moving, rotating, or scaling, you're moving it based off the location of this pivot. This pivot will orientate itself based on what axis space you're currently in. If you're in the world space, the pivot will always move, for example, Z, based on what is up and down in the world space. Then you have what's called local space, and that is the object itself. Now, if you don't rotate an object and its axis in any sort of way, you're pretty much always going to be working off of the world space's constraints. Now, to quickly show you the difference between the spaces, I'm going to rotate this object along its y-axis. I'm currently rotating in local space, and you can tell because the axis is completely turning with the object. Up here on the top right, I can cycle between local and world space. View is pretty much world space and is usually the most commonly used. So if you see I've moved back to view, the axis actually changed. Z is continuously pointing up, but going to local, Z is pointing up for the object itself. This is really handy, for example, if I'm moving objects around and I'm moving it in the world space, Z is always going to move the object up and down. But if I start moving the world on its local space, Z is now going to let me move the object up and down based off the pivot's rotation. Back to the rotation tool, we'll rotate the object around the y-axis back to default. Each one of these axes is acting like a pole that's being stuck through the object. Keep in mind how the axis is being drawn on the screen, and make sure whenever you're rotating the object, you're rotating it properly. Really handy techniques. For example, if you're rotating an object for the first time, you can rotate it, say 45 degrees. Since this is in local space, if I try to rotate it along the Z, it's going to rotate around its local pivot and rotate like if you're doing a fan or something like that. But now if I rotate it on the world space, it'll allow me to rotate the object based off of if you need to do like a ramp or something like that, and simply rotate it so you can place it alongside a wall in a different way. You'll find yourself going to be cycling between view and local spaces quite frequently, so make sure you go out of your way to try to learn and become comfortable with how they work. On the bottom of the screen, there's 3 fields, X, Y, and Z. These will show you your current information based off the 3 axes at any time. So in this case, it's showing me the actual center point, the pivot of this object, its current location within the world, its X, Y, and Z coordinates. Now if I use rotation, it'll give me that object's rotation values. Since I rotated this object 45 degrees, you now see it says -45. If I type in 0, it'll go back to where it was when it was first created. One really interesting thing to note about CryEngine 3 is that whenever you expect to rotate things, you expect them to rotate from 0 to 360 to do a full turn. In CryEngine 3, you almost think of 0 as already starting on 180, and it's going either positive or negative. So whenever you rotate an object around, you'll see it either going in the positive direction to 180, and then if you keep rotating, it'll start counting down from the negative. So you never actually see 360 or any value above 180. It goes to positive 180 to negative 180. The thing you're going to frequently see is whenever I press the shift key, you'll see values appear and little lines be drawn outside the object. What this is doing is it's actually drawing a raycast from the pivot point to the nearest render mesh and showing you your distance. Don't confuse this with the distance from your edge boundary face to the object. It's always from your pivot location to that object. This is really handy if you're trying to very closely drop objects in and making sure they align properly. Okay, so let's go into editing mode for this solid. Whenever you have a solid selected, over in the solid parameters, there's this editing mode button. Go ahead and press it, and you'll bring up the ability to select different parts of the mesh types and then do other things like select by material ID and other options. So real quickly, selection type, vertex. A vertex is a point. Almost think of whenever you're drawing a triangle, you have 3 points to a triangle. The vertex are those points. So every polygon has those 3 points. An edge is what you would consider a segment. It's what connects between the 2 points. One really important thing to remember with CryEngine 3 is whenever you're working with edges, you got to make sure you're being really careful, because sometimes you'll select an edge in the middle of a face and not even really be aware, and you can easily create some malformed objects. Face will let you select 2 polys that are joined together and around there's edge highlights around them. This is the most commonly used whenever you're working in the edit solid mode. Make sure you pay attention to where your axis is whenever you're selecting any sort of sub object on your solid. This will give you your pinpoint location of what you have selected. Whenever you select more than one object, it'll try to average its location out. Also pay attention to what space you're currently editing in. For example, on this, I'm in local, so the axis is all screwed up because it's trying to average out the space. If I work in view, it's always going to make sure I'm working in an even distributed axis. To move face or vertex or edge, simply select it and move it along the axis constraint. At any time, you can press shift space and you'll be removed from the turquoise box and actually see what your finished solid looks like a lot easier. Moving edges can be really helpful if you're doing things like creating a ramp or other slants. Sometimes you might need to go into edit vertex mode to do very specific things and create a non-boxy object. If you find you're not getting the range you want, you can always drop your grid size down to lower values to let you modify the object at a lot smaller precision. Once you're satisfied with your changes to your solid, simply press escape and you'll be taken out of editing mode for that solid. Okay, now that we've gone over how to quickly edit a solid once you have it created, let's talk about the CSG operations. First one we're going to talk about is union. What union will do is it will add two CSGs together. Now, this is really useful because it will get rid of any faces that are unseen where these solids connect. So let's go ahead and we can select two solids and click union. You'll see that it changed, and now all of a sudden this solid's bounding box, which is this kind of see-through box. Don't be confused, that's not actually there. If you press shift space again, that'll disappear. That's just the bounding box of the actual mesh. You'll also notice there's some extra edges on the solid. Now if you poke your camera through, you'll see that all the faces that used to be inside are now gone. Difference is the operation of subtraction. So if I'm going to make a difference, that means I'm going to usually cut into another object. This is really useful if you're creating doors and windows, and it's really the only CSG operation you'll find yourself using quite frequently. So to use this different CSG operation, it's A minus B. So that's going to be A, and that's what you want to have. That's like the mesh you want left behind, and this is usually be like the wall if you want a door cut out. B is going to be the shape you're going to be using to cut with, and this will be usually like the shape of the door or something like that. So let's move this into place to where the cut will happen. And in this case, what it's going to do is actually create a cut where this solid currently is. So first select what you want A to be, hold control and select what you want B to be, and press difference. You now see that the solid's been split up and you have a clean subtraction. You have to be really careful about this because keep in mind these CSG operations aren't perfect. A lot of the time, sometimes you'll just have a mesh that is just getting messed up. There will be open faces and there will be errors that's created by it. So always make sure you keep an eye on it and see what's happening. Unfortunately, if you are seeing those results, all we can really tell you to do is try the things like make the mesh smaller, create new solids and try again, all things like that, but there's not really any clear answer to what creates those types of errors. Intersection you can use if you want two objects and you want to almost divide what's there, and whatever's left behind in that intersection is all you have left over. In this case, I'm going to intersect these two solids, and it's going to leave where these solids were overlapping a solid mesh. I haven't found too many uses for this, but you might find situations where this can be really handy for you. One really important thing to note is whenever you're doing an operation, if either intersect, union, or difference, anytime you do these, go ahead and make sure you press this button that says reset X form. And what that's doing is, especially with the bounding box, collision, and the physics and interaction size of the object, sometimes it can get a little messy whenever you're applying operations like this. Resetting X form will make sure that the mesh in its current state, what you're seeing is rendered, is going to act and behave properly at all times. So generally whenever you do an operation, a CSG operation, try to make sure to reset the X form when you're done. If your solid somehow gets off the grid, you can press the snap to grid button, and it will go to the grid based on the nearest grid point you have selected here in the grid snap settings. Save to CGF is if you have a solid you think it's good enough to be considered a normal CGF, and that is a CGF again is a brush. It's like just a 3D model similar to a solid that's in the game world. It's not CSG though, so keep that in mind.